Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So if we start looking at the syllabus this week, week 4 already, and today we're supposed to cover chapters 5, 6, and 17. The students are starting to submit their multimodal presentations. So students submitted for chapters 5 and 17. So I'll concentrate my efforts on chapter 6 then, since that one wasn't covered. And we can focus there. And then if you have any questions about the other 2 chapters, we can try and deal with those if we have time. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the assignment. So everybody has their keywords approved now, so we can start to move forward on the research. If you haven't already done so, you should start doing research using your keywords, and remember to use a variety of the keywords. So you're not exactly locked into those ones that I approve, that you might use variations, like somebody was using English learners, and I asked her to please try and use English language learners, ELLs. So you might try a variety of words to get the results that you need. You know, the content will be guided by the keywords, but you might need to manipulate them a little bit when you do your research to find the articles you want. So next week, then you need to start to submit the annotated bibliography summaries. And I think I talked about that a little bit before. So it's just a question of submitting 2 annotations by next Sunday. And those are just a quick summary of the article that you read that you intend to use for your lit review final paper. And you should start at the very top and have the name of the article in APA format. And then you can include quotes if you want to have quotes in the, like I see the annotated bibliography as my note-taking for the paper I'm going to write. So I personally make them kind of long, and I will add quotations that I might use in my paper later, or notes about, you know, what was the most important findings in the study that you might want to include in your paper. And then if you want to add your own reflection on that too, you can. So you might want to start, you know, just kind of making notes to self of what was interesting about the article that you want to include. And I think, as I mentioned before in a previous class, then I'll correct the annotated bibliographies and send them back to you. And then on the subsequent week, when you need to submit 2 more, you're going to add them to the same paper. So clean up any feedback I gave you and address that in the first 2, and then add 2 more on. Usually the feedback is about APA formatting of the article title, not too much about content, but because I'm not too concerned about, you know, spelling and punctuation and grammar and things like that in the annotated bibliographies. It's the most important thing is that you have sufficient notes for yourself to help you to compile your lit review as we move along. And then
Dr. Julie, you see that Michelle's here, right?
Yeah, I let her in. Hi, Michelle. How are you?
Okay, just checking.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Hi, Michelle. Are you doing well?
I am, Dr. Julie. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hello.
Great. So how is it going for you two with the reading? Are you being able to keep up? Are you doing well with it?
Well, I'm trying. You know, I fall a little bit behind on the on that assignment, and we have to make notes of each chapter that we like. So I'm trying to work with that. Right now I need to read 2 more chapters, but I'm just trying my best to do it, to finish it at the end of the week.
Okay, all right, that's all we can ask for. Good job. And Shannon, how are you doing? How's the reading going for you? Are you doing okay?
Yeah, I'm keeping up so far, but with the annotated bibliographies coming up, I'm a little worried about fitting it all in, but that's student life. We'll make it work.
Yeah, exactly. It's tough. And this week it was good because we kind of made it top heavy with the reading before the annotated bibliographies were really due. So you had the 3 chapters due for this week. So was a lot of reading. It's kind of dense too, so it's a little bit difficult to navigate, but thanks for doing your best. But yeah, you're right, that's the life of a student, so we'll do our best. So let's start to look at the chapter then. Before I get into the chapter, let me just say a little thing about the keyword map, just to keep in mind. So that's not due until the following week, until the end of week 5. And I may have mentioned before, but the keyword map is just kind of like a graphic organizer that you're going to use to help guide your writing process. So this is a pre-writing activity that will help you to organize your thoughts for writing the lit review. So it's a graphic organizer, and not everybody is visual. The majority of students are visual, but I did have one student once who just couldn't work with the visual map at all, and he really wanted to do just an outline, which is fine too. The format is somewhat irrelevant. What's important is that you have a map in your mind as a writer before you set out to write this project, because it needs to be kind of organized. So there's some samples there in Blackboard that you can take a look at later. They're not perfect, they're student samples, so they needed some work, but they give you an idea at least of what I'm looking for. And there's a program that I suggest that you use for the keyword map if you want, that I posted there in Blackboard, and you can download a free version of it that you can use. If you don't want to use that, that's fine. You can draw the keyword map yourself. There are some keyword map templates available on the web that you could find that perhaps you could manipulate. Also inside Word, you can use draw. So you can draw, and there's also, I think I talked to you before about Smart Art, which is available in PowerPoint. That you might use. So there are various tools. I'm not concerned about the tool. You don't have to use the tool I suggest. But what's important is that you and I are clear on the steps that you intend to take for your writing. So it needs to be structured in a specific way. So the shape at the top will be the title of the paper. And then the next level are what we call your B-level heads. So the top one is the A-level head, or the title of the paper. And then the B-level heads are the main sections of the paper. So it's going to be like, you should have probably about 3, no more than 4 B-level heads. That if you get more than that, it's just a lot of work. It's really not required to do more than that. And then under each B-level head, then you'll have another shape and lines going down from that B-level head. So it's kind of like a pyramid. So you have A, and then like 3 shapes for B. And then under each of the 3 for B, you might have another 3 or so. And those are what we call the C-level heads. You might also call them levels 1, 2, and 3. And if you write an outline in linear form, it's just going to be like that. So you have the title, and then you have the A level head, you know, so when you do it with, the title is Roman numeral 1, and then A, B, and C in capital letters are the B level heads. And then you use small Roman numerals of 1, 2, and 3 for the C level heads. So this is to help you kind of conceptualize the topics that you want to cover. So you need to kind of start doing a little bit of reading on your keywords for you to know where you're going to go with this topic before you actually start writing. So that's why you submit 2 annotations 1 week, and then you start working on your keyword map when you're working on the next two annotations. So by then you've read 4 articles. So you should have a notion of where you want to go. I'll give you feedback on it and tell you, you know, if you need to restructure or reorganize. Each of the geometric shapes in each of the levels should be represented by a different shape and a different color. So you can use a square or an oval or a circle or a triangle on the different levels because they're distinct from each other. So you want to make it clear in your visual representation that these are subcategories of the idea that was above it. And so there's a line coming down to the subcategory. So this will help us to help you when in your writing so that you can really get straight to the point and not write a lot about something that's not super relevant to your topic, or make sure that you have a logical sequence in your ideas too. So in the keyword map, when you have the A, B, and C, the B's should be in sequence from left to right, as if you were reading it. And then the C level heads as well. So they go from left to right under the B level heads. So that's how we'll see the linear progression of the logic of the ideas in your paper. So then there's another revision of that. So I'll send it back to you and give you my feedback on it. And then you'll continue working on your annotated bibliography in week 6. You need to submit 3. So you'll revise the second 2, because you've already revised the first 2. If necessary, you may not need to revise. And then you'll add 3 more annotations onto the same paper and resubmit it to Blackboard. So you don't need to open a new paper each time you do an annotated bibliography. You're going to just keep adding it on. It's going to be a running list of your annotations. And then when we get to week 7, you'll submit a revision of your keyword map. So we might work back and forth over those next 2 weeks where I'll give you feedback and give you some ideas. And, you know, if you want to submit it to me again before it's actually due on week 7, please feel free and I'll give you my feedback on that. So we'll work back and forth, so then you'll be really clear when you start writing. And then slowly you submit like the introduction to your lit review. And this course is very nicely scaffolded to really help you and guide you in writing your lit review, because it's quite a big project. So just to remind you, you do need to find 15 articles that you will use in your lit review, and all 15 articles need to be listed in your keyword map. So under level C is where you're going to put the articles that have the theory that support the ideas in the hierarchy above, so in that C and B level. You might have one article that supports the ideas in 2 or 3 of the topics that you're discussing. So it's fine to have multiple lines from one article to different ideas. Keep that in mind. It doesn't need to be one article for each idea. So you don't need to have 15 C-level heads and one article for each C-level head. It's not usually the way it works. So usually one article will address 2 or 3 different ideas, usually not always. So you do need to list all 15 articles on the keyword map, but you don't need to submit annotations for all 15. You only need to submit annotations for 10.
Dr. Julie, can I ask for this paper, we're only to use peer-reviewed articles, right? Because when I search in the PFAL library, I'm getting a ton of dissertations under my results, but I need to narrow it and only use peer-reviewed articles, right?
If you want to use a dissertation, you can. Yeah, that's certainly a valid source of information for your paper. You could do that. Do you have access to the full dissertation when you find them?
I didn't click and open them because I didn't think that I could use them, so I don't know.
It's okay if you want to, that's fine. The only caveat with using a dissertation is that they're usually pretty long. So with the articles, they tend to be about 20 pages each, whereas a dissertation could be around 100. So, you know, if you choose a lot of dissertations, you'll probably have a lot of reading, unless you can just focus in on that section of the dissertation that's relevant to you. But just something to kind of keep in mind, but that's fine if you want to use that as a source.
Thank you.
Sure. It's certainly a credible source. So the main issue is that it be credible. So. Okay, so let's look at the PowerPoint for this chapter then. Let's see, where is it? There we go. Okay, it's hidden. I have too many windows open. All right, so Michelle, as I mentioned before you jumped in, I think, was that the students are starting to submit their multimodal presentations on the chapters. So I'm going to focus on chapter 6 because there were 2 students who prepared the PowerPoints for the other 2 chapters that you were supposed to have read for this week. So I'll post those in Blackboard for you so you can use those as well, and it will help you to review the chapter. After I grade them, I'll post them, just make sure that they're okay, but they just got submitted yesterday, so I haven't had a chance to grade them yet.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so this chapter is talking about EIL and literacy. So as we know, like EIL, we're talking about English all over the world in different locations with different people in different contexts. And so they talk a lot about the context in this chapter. And I think that that's really true for everything in life, is that you always have to take the context into consideration. Things don't happen in a vacuum. There's always situational factors that will affect what's going on. So the same can be said for English as an international language. There are obviously many, many, many different locations where English is being used, and people have different objectives for using the language, and they're using it in different situations themselves, so they have different purposes for the use. And we talked a little bit before about English lingua franca, and then they bring on another acronym. TESOL is so full of acronyms, so they talk about lingua franca English as well. So it's the same thing, perhaps a little bit easier to say. So they're talking, it's kind of nice though now in the reading, because we're kind of starting to circle back on some ideas that we've seen before and established kind of clearly in some of the earlier readings. So we want to kind of circle back and look at the ideas of language competence and literacy standards. So what can either of you tell me about language competence?
Well, I feel that language competence is usually, you know, a lot of people see it as being able to talk proper English, use correct grammar, um, also writing. So I feel that a lot of people consider that language competence, but as we have learned, um, I feel that mm, everyone has competence to speak English. It's just like you know, there's different world Englishes, but that's what I think, Dr. Julie.
I was thinking the same thing with language competence. I'm thinking about maybe it depends on the situation. Like it makes me think of EAP, ESP, English for specific purposes. Maybe their competence in English has to do with just a specific field and not necessarily like native like fluency or anything. Dr. Julie, you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, so Michelle, you gave a great definition. It certainly is very connected with our notions of correctness in language and kind of measured in terms of grammatical accuracy and accuracy in syntax and pronunciation. But Shannon, you bring a really good point. It absolutely is dependent upon the situational factors and for what purpose you intend to use the language. So you might be very, very competent in speaking with friends in social contexts, but you might not dominate the language in academic contexts or in maybe in medical contexts or something like that, where it has very specific vocabulary associated with it. And then not only that, but we also have emotional connections with certain situations. So you might need to use the language while you're under stress, and you have that old issue of competence versus performance. So perhaps you know the structure, but for whatever reason, you're actually not able to perform at the level of your competence because you're stressed or tired or anxious or afraid or some negative emotion. I don't know, it might even be a positive. Maybe you're so overwhelmed with joy and gratitude that you just can't find the words. It could happen. But in general, the negative emotions tend to kind of suppress our neuronal abilities to make connections and to be able to find vocabulary. It seems to interfere with that, and particularly in a second language. And you may have experienced this in your first language. It happens there too. Sometimes you're just too tired to think properly. And what can you tell me about literacy standards? What do you understand by that?
I will say that literacy standards are the standards that maybe society has put. For example, the reading, writing, listening. So being able to read and write, and you know, the standards that sometimes you need to acquire that native like competence in order to fit into that maybe the American culture or a new culture. So just those standards of, you know, English correctness or the native concept of speaking a second language.
Okay. Shannon, what do you want to add to that?
Not so sure what literacy standards are, but given what we've read this week about taking into account situational context and cultural context, I imagine standards probably vary, depend on where you're from or what the situation is.
Right, yeah. So literacy is the ability to read and write. And so we often think of this process with children as they learn to read and they become literate. And when we're talking about it in an ESL or EFL or EIL context, sometimes we're talking about adults gaining literacy in another language. So it's their ability to read and write in the other language. And it certainly could be measured by parameters of native speaker competence. And I think that that's like the main message of this whole book is what they're trying to drive home, is that this hegemonic belief from the inner circle powers that be, that native-like competency and the American or British standard is not always necessarily required or even the best. And, you know, there really is no notion of better or best in language. They all meet the criterion of being able to communicate, which is the issue. So we do tend to impose these standards of native-like competency, but this is what this chapter is trying to question. Are those standards that are imposed from the outside, are they always necessary? And we have to kind of stop to think about them, because we don't want to be part of the system that just encourages the status quo to continue as it is. So we might want to question, based on our students' needs, what standards are necessary for them. So then they talk a little bit about the concept of pragmatics, and that's really the notion of knowing how to use the language according to the situation. So if you know, depending on who you're speaking with, how to change it up, and if it's appropriate to use bad words or slang, or if you should use a more formal register, even like interrupting in some cultures is fine, and in others it's considered rude. So these are these social conventions of language that are usually not taught, that we kind of have to pick up on our own. But that's certainly a huge part of language competence, is the pragmatics of knowing how to switch it up and how to use the appropriate form and structure and vocabulary for the situation. Then they talk a little bit more about ethnographic perspectives, and that was the notion of looking at the context, the larger context. So it's not just the small context of exactly where the conversation itself is taking place, but also the idea that looking at the society and the people and the socioeconomic status of that society or that group as a whole, and how that how people use language in that whole situation. So you have kind of like a macro and a larger perspective. I don't know if I would call it micro, because you have a micro perspective and a more macro perspective, but it's not necessarily global. It's kind of ethnographic, means according to ethnos, the word means like people or race. So it's a study of that group of people. So it might not be like at the level of the whole country. That's why I'm a little bit reticent to use the word macro perspective, because it is a larger perspective, but it's not necessarily the largest. You could go out bigger, but ethno refers to the people who you are studying or working with. So once again, we're just questioning this native speaker, let me let Jane in. We're questioning this native speakerism and native speakerness, and asking, you know, is that always the universal benchmark? Is that always the right way to speak? Is that always the correct way? So we've always taught that there's a standard variety, and that's what we aim to teach. at school. But there was some really interesting information in this chapter where they were talking about teachers who did not use the standard variety of English in the US in some location. I don't remember where it was, maybe one of you remembers from the reading, but the teachers could be let go if they didn't use the standard variety. So there's some kind of language police that goes on to make sure that people are using the correct variety. I don't know if you all remember this, but in the 1990s and 80s, there was a big controversy that up in the Bay Area in Oakland in California, there was a movement for the teachers to teach what's called Ebonics, which is like Black American English. And there've been studies done that show, like, you can kind of categorize what Ebonics or African American English, there are several different words for it and abbreviations. So there have been studies of discourse done that kind of analyze it and show certain things that occur, like maybe leaving out the verb to be, or using the verb to be in the infinitive instead of conjugating it, or dropping off the S in the third person singular present tense of the verb. So there's some very, like, when you look at it from a linguistic perspective, there are some very specific things that happen with African American English. And so there was a movement in this period of time to teach that variety at schools. And it was a huge controversy because the powers that be were hugely opposed to it. They said it really wasn't fair at all because what you were doing was kind of keeping the young African American students in using a type of English that was not considered appropriate for the work environment. So if they wanted to get a white-collar job, it would be very difficult for them if they didn't have the standard variety of English. And the opponents were saying, well, this is what they speak at home. This is what they speak in their community. If they speak standard English in their community, oftentimes they are criticized and shunned and frowned upon. And they're treated like they're trying to be somebody that they're not, or they're trying to, so there's a lot of issues with identity in terms of the language that we speak. And so the speakers themselves would feel uncomfortable in using this standard variety because it's not what they spoke on a day-to-day basis. So they were saying that you should honor their social context and in schools teach using that variety. So what's your opinion on that situation? How do you feel about that? Do you think that that was a good idea to try and teach Ebonics in the schools to use their variety of the language, or do you think that it would have been better for them to learn the standard variety? And
torn about this. Like I just don't know. I feel like, on the one hand, I feel like, well, if they already speak Ebonics, then they're using it at home, so use something else at school so they could learn something new. But on the other hand, I feel like yeah, I don't know. I'm really torn. I'm really torn.
Jeannie or Michelle, do you want to add something?
Well, I think it's hard, like Shao was mentioning, but I think it will be, well, in my opinion, I think it will be in some way a good idea to, you know, teach the concept of Ebonics, because, well, now in today's society, you know, different students, well, they have different forms of speaking English. You know, we have slang English, and then we have the formal English. So I think that it is important that they're exposed to different forms of English, and that's like part of the terminology that we're learning about world Englishes. So I think that it will be okay, but I don't know, it's just hard. I think it will be a good idea, but at the same time, not. But I will just leave it like that, Dr. Julie, just a good idea because they will be able to learn different forms of world Englishes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly complex, right? You have the pros and cons of each, where you're trying to honor somebody's home environment. And I think Shah had a good point that if they're already using it at home, I think that the school is a formal context. And so the variety that we tend to use in a formal context is more the standard variety. And I do think that there's a point to the argument that they could eventually be excluded from executive level positions, for example, if they were not very well versed in the standard variety, which is part of the requirement for executive level positions in terms of literacy. And what about the Common European Framework of Reference? So that's where, I don't know if you've seen before, but where if students take a test or at an ESL school or an EFL school, they'll have their levels according to the CEFR. Usually it's just referred to as CEFR. They usually leave out the L for some reason, but people will call it the CEFR. And so it goes from A to C, so you have A1, A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. And so A is beginner, B is intermediate, and C is advanced levels. So a lot of schools will have like a 6-level course, and pretty much when you finish each level, you have finished one of the CEFR levels. So this is, again, kind of a little bit controversial. Remember when we talked about gatekeepers before? So when people take a standardized test, which is a gatekeeper for them to get into an institution or to get citizenship, or there's many different reasons why people might take a standardized language test. But it does give us this frame of reference. So it's very convenient because when they say level B1, we know very well what they're referring to in terms of what the student can and cannot do. And they actually have lists of that are very clear, that list what the student is able to do, like if they're able to use modals, or if they can use past perfect or present perfect. And so it's based on grammar as well as situations. So they should be able to handle different situations. So it's convenient in that we all understand what those different levels mean. But on the other hand, let me ask you this first question here. How might it contribute negatively towards this notion of the ownership of English?
I think that well, since it sets what the standard is supposed to be, and when we think of the word standard, we think of like what is right and what is correct, and as we've been reading, there is no one correct way of English. There are world Englishes, there are different dialects, there are different contexts and situations of how to use English. So I think it can be negative, because when we think of standard, and then with the word European standard, makes me think, okay, this is has to do with what is it called, the coloniality of English, and it's how how to speak right, or in Black culture we say how to speak white.
Perfect. Yep, exactly. I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about the word standard. So yeah, it does have these notions of what is required and necessary, as opposed to just these levels of understanding what it means. So great. Okay.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
Hi.
Hi.
One thing I remember learning from a linguistics professor was that, that there's certain people that set the standards, and then once you have these standards, then they change. So standards are always changing. So it just really depends on the person who has the authority to do it. So you can learn a standard and then it's no longer a standard according to the person who sets it. So it's kind of just an ongoing. So that's a negative, because it's not like math. Everything is just, it is what it is. But it's not the same thing when it comes to language. It's always changing. And what's correct, it seems like it's always changing.
That's an excellent point. That's absolutely true. It does shift more than other things. And you see that very clearly with grammar, right? So when we talk about grammar teaching, we have the prescriptive method and descriptive method. Are you familiar with those two concepts?
I'm familiar with the terms, but I don't recall them at the moment, but I've heard them before.
Okay. And Shannon or me? Go ahead, Jim.
It's kind of like what a doctor, right? Like a prescriptive, like a prescription, more of a standard speaking. Am I right?
Yeah, you're on the right track.
Because I remember prescriptive, it had to do with something to do with like a doctor doing a prescription type thing. And a descriptive was a little bit like not so standard, maybe. It's been a minute. I haven't, it's been a minute.
You're on the right track. What were you going to add, Shannon?
I haven't heard those terms before.
Oh, okay. All right. So it's interesting. So there's two ways of looking at grammar. The prescriptive, like you said, Jeannie, is like a doctor writing a prescription. It's what should be done. So according to prescriptive grammar, you should not have a preposition at the end of a sentence. So the sentence, "Who are you looking at?" is wrong. You should say, "At whom are you looking?" So that's according to prescriptive grammar. Well, in reality, if you go out in the street and speak like that, people are going to think you're a fool, because nobody talks like that. You will sound pompous and arrogant. So descriptive grammar is to describe the way that people actually speak, and then teach it according to that. So prescriptive is the lofty rule that everybody should follow, and descriptive is what people actually do. So Jeannie, you had a great point when you said that the standards change, because in the past, actually, people did talk that way, but nowadays they don't. So the prescriptive rule eventually changes, because you get to the point where nobody speaks like that anymore. So it's very silly to even teach it, because it sounds so antiquated and formal that there's no sense in teaching it. So it's a great point that it does, the standards change with a long time. So it's kind of that question about the Ebonics. What do you teach? Do you teach the descriptive of what people are actually using, or do you teach the prescriptive of what we think they should be using, what they should be saying? So we talked before a little bit about these concepts of globalization and internationalization and how that has spread English. In previous chapters, they focused a lot on media and how media has helped English to spread around the world. And we've talked already a lot about these questions of power, political power, and social prestige, and that being connected with this native speaker superiority, because they're holding on to that notion of what is correct and what is right. And so as long as native speakers are able to criticize incorrect or different varieties of the language, then they can kind of maintain their position of power in terms of language use, and then that language power can spill over into other areas, because if you don't speak that variety, you can be denied access through one of those gatekeepers. And so you have this continual relationship between domination and subjugation. So you always have one group that's on top of another that has more power and prestige than the other. And that's closely connected with the variety of the language that they speak. So nowadays, I mean, in our context in the MA-TESOL program, we're talking about English, but that has happened historically with other languages in the past. In the past, French used to be the international language of medicine, for example. And it's very closely related to military and political power. And then as the French international empire started to recede after the Napoleonic era and the British Empire arose, the English language went along with their conquests around the world. And you see the same thing with Spanish too. That's how Spanish went to Latin America, was from the Spaniards in Europe when they were navigating the world and colonizing the world. So there's an obvious, very close relationship between power and language. Then they bring up some ideas about people moving around the world. And never has it been easier than the current time for people to migrate and change countries and live in different places. Way back in the 1800s and until the 1900s, people usually did not travel more than 20 miles radius outside of the village where they were born. There were some, of course, there were people like Marco Polo and, you know, some merchants that would go from China to India and to Europe, but it was rather rare. Like the great majority of people never left their circle of where they were born. And nowadays it's quite common for people to travel. So therefore they have much more contact with other variants of the language, as well as other languages and other cultures and other contexts. What's this chapter brings that's new is they talk about this idea of circular migration, where people might go and come back. So maybe they'll go and stay for a period of time in a foreign country and then come back to their home country, or go to another country and then go back to country B or back to country A. So it's just much more fluid, and this tends to break up this domination, subjugation type of dynamic that we've been so used to. It's way easier to hold positions of power when things are static. When things are dynamic and people and media are spreading language and customs and ideas around the world, it's a lot harder for the powerful class to hold on to the standard and the way they think things should be. And with this, the concept of international education particularly has really had to deal with this issue, because student mobility has never been so high as it is right now, with students all over the world studying in different locations. And the interesting thing that has happened just in the last 2 or 3 years, in the past, the most important countries for students to go to for an international education were those countries in the inner circle. So the vast majority, it was over 80% of students who did a study abroad would go to either the US, Canada, Australia, or New Zealand. Now, just recently, in the last 2 or 3 years, China and Russia and South Korea have taken a good chunk of the market. And it's interesting, it's occurred for a variety of reasons. One is mainly because of the immigration policies in the US. So it had started before the Trump administration, but since the chaos with the Trump administration in terms of visa uncertainties and as to whether foreigners will be welcomed when they arrive, et cetera. So people are honestly a bit afraid to come to the US now to study, because they believe that they're going to not be welcomed or not get a visa or get kicked out once they get here. So as you well know, it's a huge investment. And so they're concerned about coming to the US. So they're looking for other alternatives. But at the same time, students also, like new opportunities opened up in these other locations. So Russia has become very well known for medical schools now. And a lot of people in the former Soviet Union who speak Russian, who can go there and easily take advantage of the educational programs, are taking advantage of going there. And then people are seeing the need for speaking languages in addition to English as foreign languages. So Chinese and Korean and Russian as a foreign language have really been on the rise. So students are going there. And these countries are smart because it's a $30 billion a year business in the US for international education. So it's a huge business. And so now China just recently, just this year, launched an incentive program for international students to go and study in China in programs offered in English, because they realize that it's going to be difficult for people who don't know Chinese yet to go and study at the higher education levels. So they're offering the degrees in English, and they're offering scholarships for students to go there and study. So they're really trying to kick it off and get some momentum. They'll probably diminish the scholarships once they start to get momentum. So there's some interesting changes that are happening in terms of higher education due to this internationalization. Can you think of any other examples where this historical domination subjugation relationship is changing? I think Hong Kong is a good example. So if you remember in the past, Hong Kong was owned by China, or well, actually I lie. It was on a 99-year lease to the British, I wanted to say to the British Empire, but to the UK. And they had administrative powers in Hong Kong. And then I think it was in the year 2001, they had to turn it over back to mainland China. So that was a huge shift in power. Something similar happened with the Panama Canal. So the Panama Canal was also on a 99-year lease to the United States. The United States went down there and helped to build it, and then they retained control over it. But the deal was with the country that then eventually they would turn it back over to the country. So it was a huge source of pride for the Panamanians to take over control of the Panama Canal. And it has huge, for both of these examples that I just gave in Hong Kong as well as in Panama, it had huge economic consequences as well. So it wasn't something that the powers that be wanted to give up, but that was part of the initial agreement. So that was a huge example of a shift. And then there were obvious language shifts as well. So in Hong Kong, they tended to speak English because of the British influence. And then once it became part of China, then Chinese became more prominent. Of course, there's still a lot of English spoken there because of the businesses that had already been established there and the fact that it is an international business hub. But the language issues certainly changed. So the dominance of English in Panama changed when the Panamanians took over the canal and they started to emphasize the use of Spanish more. So the two examples I gave also gives a real clear shift in values, right? So it's one of those situational contexts that will affect the locals who live there, and there's usually a lot of fear leading up to a transition like that, and people aren't sure how the new administration is going to handle it, or if they'll be competent or not, and what kind of impositions. There was a lot of fear when Hong Kong went back to China that they would no longer be able to have free commerce there, and that the Chinese would make a lot of restrictions and impositions. But as I mentioned in the example with them opening for higher education in English, I mean, they're intelligent about business and they didn't want to kill the business. It's a huge source of income for them. So there was a lot of fear, but it turned out that it wasn't necessary. It wasn't well founded, but nobody knew how they were going to handle it. So let's talk about this confident multiculturalists a little bit. So when we talk about people in their social space, when you can use the language in that social space, it certainly contributes to your ability to feel confident. And so being able to dominate multiple norms of language as well as social contexts can help people to feel more confident when they're navigating multicultural contexts. They had this interesting concept of third culture communication. So it's no longer like an us and them, it's no longer right and wrong, or we have the standard and they don't, but there's more of this sense of people who are using English as a means of communication, but they don't necessarily identify with the culture. So you have, for example, in India, which is a multi-language context, where English is the official language for multiple reasons, partially because of the British heritage, but also so that they didn't prioritize one group over the other. So the Hindu population is generally more in the north of the country, and the I don't know if that's right. It's strange because actually there's a lot more Muslims in the north of the country than in the south. However, they speak Urdu more in the south than in the north. Maybe along the Pakistan border, I'm not sure. But anyway, there's kind of a distinction between the L1, or not the L1, but the language of prestige for the Hindus is Hindi, and the language of prestige for the literary language, the library language of the Muslims is Urdu. So there's a lot of poetry and things like that written in Urdu. And so anyway, when India became independent, they couldn't choose they couldn't choose Hindi because that would ostracize the Muslims in the country. So they had to choose English because English didn't belong to anybody as a native language in India. So it kind of had this third culture space where it was neither mine nor yours. So it didn't have this association of power with it. It was neutral in this case. So that's kind of interesting because we've been talking about English language as a dominant feature until now. And so now we can see how it can hold a neutral role as well. They talked a lot in this chapter about conversation analysis, and we talked a little bit about that last class, I think, and they talked a lot about Paul G. He's a famous author from, I think he's at Cal State Northridge, and he does a lot of, his research is on the area of discourse analysis. So he looks a lot at how people speak and analyzes their turn taking. And we looked a little bit at that in the Fairclough article that we discussed last week. And so you look at things like overlap in conversation, or interruptions, or not finishing sentences, trailing off, pauses, who can interrupt who, Now, so he talks about discourse with a big D and discourse with a little d. So discourse with a big D are kind of like the standards and that are set up in terms of discourse turn taking. And then discourse with the little d is the situational discourse. So what's going on in this conversation, which may or may not follow the norms. Or if it doesn't, why not? And if it does, why? Is that because of external constraints, or what are the reasons? So it's kind of looking at what's going on beyond the conversation that imposes some constraints on the conversation itself. So what do you think, what can you tell me about notions of correctness and appropriateness in EIL?
And I think this just relates to what we've been reading all week about that correctness and appropriateness. It's situational and cultural, and that there is no one correct standard in English as an international language.
Absolutely. Okay. So then the chapter kind of goes into literacy studies and looking more at literacies as a social practice. And once again, looking at these notions of norms and ideological standards in terms of literacy. So now we're talking a little bit more about the written word than the spoken word. So when we're talking about discourse, we're generally talking about the spoken word. It's usually conversation or dialogue. Whereas literacy has this notion of reading and writing, so it's usually the written word. So there are different ways of looking at these. They talk about then the new literacy studies. So literacy studies in the past was really looking very strictly at just reading and writing. And then now the new literacies is looking at multimedia and how that is influencing these notions of literacy. And I'm sure that you would all agree that our notions of literacy have changed as a result of the influence of media. So like, for example, writing text messages is the obvious example where people use emojis and abbreviations. And so like there's a new standard for what is considered appropriate in that media. And like writing blogs, it's certainly less formal than writing a magazine article, for example. And so each of these literacies has their own standards. And so media has kind of changed what we understand as literacy. And so now it's gotten a little bit away from the written word. It's not only the written word. We can now also use images, videos, pictures, drawings, and symbols, signs are considered part of literacy. So it's being able to read and interpret and see and understand what's occurring in media. This is kind of a long question. Let me read it out loud so we can get clear on it. So how does this shift in literacy studies concerning social practice relate to the shift in language competence concerning the international nature of English? Is it feasible to talk of an ideological model of EIL? Well, let's stick to the first half of it. So just to go back and break it down a little bit. So this shift in literacy studies is what I was talking about, is the shift is now shifting towards new literacy studies, the NLS, and including other types of media. And so how does that change our notions of language competence in this international arena? Any suggestions?
Competence, then again, it's going to be situational and cultural. Like sometimes when my younger brother texts me and he'll use these abbreviations, acronyms, I'll have no idea what he's saying. I don't understand what FR stands for, what LLS means, and we have trouble communicating. So I'm not literate in that sense.
Perfect example, perfect example. So we think of ourselves as being very literate, right? We can read these complex chapters and break them apart and understand them intellectually, but we're talking about old literacy studies. So we might be illiterate in the new literacy studies. So that's a great example. Thank you. All right, so what's new in new literacy studies? You always have this situational context, and the emojis and the abbreviations that we use in English obviously are very different from other languages and other locations. I think it's kind of funny, so like in English, we write ha 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 ha, right? Or H-A-H-A-H-A. In Spanish, they write J-A-J-A-J-A, right? So it's still ha 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 ha, but with different spelling for Spanish. In Portuguese, they write K-K-K-K because they say ka-ka-ka-ka, right? When they're laughing. And in Arabic, they write just H-H-H-H-H, right? So this local context can totally change the literacy. And that's talking about a word that's like it's an interjection, right? It's not even a word, but the way that it's expressed in different languages is different in these new literacies. And so it's always, we always have to take a situated approach. It's not possible anymore to take a global, always this is right and this is wrong stance. That's kind of been thrown out with the new literacy studies. And then we have this shift from this binary of us versus them, or right versus wrong, or standard versus non-standard, to thinking about ideology versus autonomy. And so he was kind of breaking that down in terms of those two different concepts of looking at an ideological concept versus an autonomous or independent concept. And then if we want to think of like a social justice perspective, so we might think of looking at literacy for equity as well as for justice. So by making the language available to everybody and not having this domination, subjugation, binary power struggle anymore, then we can focus more on giving people a sense of power and autonomy. However, literacy is still associated with cognition, that you do have to have a certain level of intellectual development to be able to understand the literacy, even new literacies with media. But I don't know if any studies have been done. It would be amazing to see, but I think it's so amazing to watch little babies with iPads and how they know to swipe and how they can sit and pay attention for so long, that I'm sure that they're becoming literate much earlier than they ever did before. And I don't know what kind of effect that's having on cognition for very young children. I suspect that their cognition is developing much more rapidly as well. Have you seen any studies about that?
No.
No?
No, Dr. Dewey.
Yes, that would be interesting to look at. I wish I had that idea. I would have made somebody do that for their lit review. Somebody who was stuck on an idea, I would have given that to them. It's so hard to get students to focus on this idea of coming up with something new to study. Everybody always gravitates to the 4 skills, like they want to look into teaching writing or vocabulary, or they want to look at motivation, some of these concepts that have been around since the 60s. And we're really trying to encourage students to choose some keywords that are really cutting edge and up to date. And that's kind of like what the reading is supposed to stimulate. And so that would be an example of an idea that would be really modern, right? Rather than just looking at motivation, let's look at young learners and their levels of cognition based on literacy with English through digital media. That would be a great study. So we've talked a lot about power. So how do we apply these new literary studies to policy? So how do local people take hold of new communicative practices introduced to them? How do you start to become comfortable with these new literacies? I'm sure that you've probably seen in the 543 class, I think, where we talk about the difference between digital natives and digital immigrants. So there's kind of an age divide here too, because the digital natives are the kids that were born into an era in which technology already existed. So it's just part of their world. They're not afraid of it. So anybody who was born after the 1990s has had the internet and computers in their lives. They're used to it. Whereas those who were born before the 90s, if you know your parents or your grandparents might feel a little bit uncomfortable about having a computer or a smartphone. They might prefer to have an older phone where they don't have all these apps. And at least in the beginning, it was difficult for them to get used to. Maybe now, finally, after 30 years or so of having all of this influence of electronic media, they're starting to get accustomed to it. But initially there's a lot of fear. And so this certainly affects the power structure as well as the communicative practices. So if these digital immigrants, the people who were not born into an era with technology and have to adopt technology, sometimes they can be excluded from conversations or from situations, or they can be judged to be less intelligent. I know this happens sometimes in my workplace where there are some older staff members who are not so tech savvy. I mean, of course they use computers and email and things like that, but in terms of managing Google Docs or Google spreadsheets or Google Forms or something like that, they feel quite intimidated, like they just can't figure it out. So sometimes the younger generation gets impatient with them and treats them differently. They might use different language with them than they would otherwise, or at least they're thinking it in their mind that they're not as competent. So we have these kind of value judgments associated with people who are adept in the new literacies versus those who don't dominate it. So it can be exclusionary as well. And it's certainly dependent on social and cultural practices. In some places it's considered acceptable, and some places people have stronger controls on where digital media can be used, what's considered appropriate or inappropriate. Certain countries have firewalls that inhibit the use of certain new digital literacies. So for example, in most of the Middle East, WhatsApp is jammed, but you can use it for text, but you can't use it for voice calls. Whereas in some other countries, it has almost taken over in place of the traditional telecom businesses. So there's still some power control in terms of how people can access certain digital media. In Venezuela, a lot of the protests are fueled by people being able to exchange messages on Twitter. And the same thing happened during the Arab Spring Revolution, that if it weren't for these new digital literacies, they wouldn't have been able to have the communication nexus necessary to be able to communicate in a situation where they needed everybody to mobilize and unify and work together. So there's limits and restrictions on these digital media and who has access to them. There's been a lot of conversation about the free internet and free access to the internet as net neutrality. So you might have followed that conversation, and that's an important conversation for allowing these communicative practices to be easily accessible by the majority of people, independent of their socioeconomic status, because without net neutrality, basically you have to pay to be able to get access to certain types of information. And it becomes much easier to control people's access to information without net neutrality.
Dr. Julie?
Yes?
I just wanted to say this whole thing about digital native, digital immigrant. I'm older, so I'm an immigrant. I took typing in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I came back to college in my 40s,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember having to do research.
Mm-hmm.
And, I know it's not about communication, but I'm just grasping the digital, what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I remember, before we actually had to go into a library and do physical research, the Dewey Decimal System, and now I felt that it wasn't even right, because it's so much easier now to access what we need to get to. I was like, this can't be legal. It was just too easy to access everything in comparison to before, where we actually had to go and get physical books and look, and research, and actually, anyway, big difference. And then just real quick, earlier today, because I'm working on my media presentation,
Mm-hmm.
and how you're saying how, when we're not native to it, it's not that I'm not ignorant, ignorant, yeah, because I'm not, comfortable with, just for example, I was putting my PowerPoint together, and I was actually able to download a YouTube video, and I had to brag to my teenage daughter that I actually did it by myself.
Good for you.
Yeah, but I just was saying, because to the native, it's so easy, but for me, it's such a big deal, and it is intimidating.
It is, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Yeah, you bring up a perfect example. So when I did my master's and my doctorate in Brazil when I lived there. And when I did my master's, all of my research was in the library, and I had to ask for interlibrary loans. I even got microfiche, where I had to, and I don't know, Shannon and Michelle, if you even know what these are, but it's like a piece of plastic strip film where they used to take pictures of the journal articles, and you would get this film and you read it on a thing kind of like a microscope. And that was their way of archiving the journals back in the day. And so I even had microfiche when I did my research. And this was in 19, when did I finish my, 2000, I finished my, is that right? Yeah, in 2000, I finished my master's. So Brazil was behind the US in terms of digital literacies and using modern technology with the internet, et cetera. So that was even in the year 2000, I was still using that format. But then I went straight into my doctorate, and by 2005, when I graduated with my doctorate, I did almost everything online. So it was a huge, quick change, but yeah, it's a lot to navigate and a lot to learn in it. And so for those of us who have experienced that shift, you can really see how it influenced, how it impacted, and the amount of information that's available. But this question of confidence is certainly connected with that. And we talked about that at the very beginning about this question of confidence and feeling how the confidence is impacts your competence. So let me, do you see the pictures, like the list of pictures, or can you just see just the slide? Like I've got the pictures on the right-hand side. Do you see that?
I just see the slide.
Oh, okay, great, because it's kind of blocking it a little bit. So I just wanted to make sure you could see it. Great. All right, so then the chapter kind of ends with implications for research and practice, which is the way that most good research articles end. Is like saying, okay, this is what we know, this is what we found out, this is really interesting. However, there's a lot that we don't know. And this is where I would encourage people to do more research to carry on. So that's usually the way research articles finish. And you might notice that while you're reading your articles for your lit review. So one of the questions that we still need to investigate and look into that we don't know yet is which version of English is being privileged and what power assumptions are the pedagogy and program design based upon. So maybe examining the situation in where you're teaching or going to teach, and just kind of keeping these ideas in mind, you know, looking at the textbooks with a critical eye. Who were they published by? You know, are there some hidden agenda, or like usually, honestly, I think it's unconscious. I honestly don't think that the majority of people are desperately struggling to retain power and hang on to their power structure. But I think that it's just a question of people just doing what they always did and not questioning it critically. And when you bring it to somebody's attention, then they stop and think, and it might take them a while, but then eventually they realize and think, oh yeah, wow, geez, that was kind of ignorant the way we used to do things a long time ago, and now we need to be a bit more open-minded. So just simple things like in the textbook where the nurse is always a female and the doctor is always a male. And, you know, it's just, we just would see that in the past and not think twice about it and not even realize that we're helping to propagate the traditional stereotypes that already existed. So, you know, just questioning those kinds of things and looking at it and trying to see if the textbook that you're using or the content you're using is continuing to propagate a traditional paradigm of power structure. So people who were labeled illiterate in the autonomous model might use literacy practices for specific purposes in specific contexts, and that's the ideological model. And so nowadays, many varieties of English coexist and enjoy a greater status and prestige. We're starting to kind of lose that native speaker dominance and like understand that it's quite a feat to learn another language. And I think that's why we require that MA TESOL students study another language if English is their first language. There's a requirement that you do 2 semesters or 3 quarters in another language, I believe. And it's for us to have empathy with how difficult it is to learn another language. It's a great thing to do, and just like remember how hard it was. We lose that empathy when we get advanced in our second language learning, and so it's very important to go through that process and to feel humble, and then therefore we can respect people more when they make mistakes in English, and rather than demand that they speak a perfect standard. We'll focus a bit more on the communication and the message that they're trying to transmit, and be in awe of the fact that they've dominated the language enough to be able to be in the situation that they're in, whether it's as a professional or as a student or even as a worker, whatever, you know, language competency that they've acquired. It's it's not easy. And so when we have that in mind, I think we kind of lose our notions of superiority, which is important. And so it's easy for us as teachers to make that leap, but then policy makers also need to kind of make that leap. And I do believe that that's occurring in society in general, where you have like the DMV offers services in multiple languages nowadays, or when you go to vote, you can vote in different languages in the US. So, or on any telephone menu, when you call CVS or something, you get the option to have the conversation in, at least in Spanish, if not in another language. So policy makers need to have this open-mindedness as well. But then that raises another question. Do you think that when people come to the US that they should be required to learn English since it's the official language of the country?
I think no, they should not be required.
So then, therefore, should the government be required to offer services in a variety of languages? Is that their obligation?
No.
You said no?
And yes, I think the government should offer services in different languages. I think officially English, officially the United States has no official language, right?
Correct.
And I think that if somebody that's English is not their first language, when they come to the States, because they're immersed in the environment, they're going to learn some level of English anyway. So I don't think it should be required that they learn the language. I think it's just going to naturally happen. And I do think this is America, and part of America is different cultures, so different languages should be offered for different services.
Mm-hmm.
I will like to add something. So I think, like Shao was saying, I believe that it is important to learn English when you arrive to the United States in order to communicate with others. But I think it shouldn't be required, like as to force people to. You have to learn it. If not, you're not gonna fit in. I think it is important to learn it, like I mentioned, in order to communicate with others. And like Shah was mentioning, in some way, it is controversial because, well, like you were mentioning, Dr. Julie, well, should the government be required to, have services in the variety of languages? And maybe, people can say no, it is not required. But in this country, we have like a variety of cultures and languages, and well, we have different perspectives and things like that. So I think all the languages should be welcome, and also we should offer services to help the other cultures as well.
What do you think, Jeannie?
I mean, as far as, to me, the word requirement is kind of a strong word. Mm-hmm. But realistically, the better your English is here, the further you're going to go. That's the harsh reality. Just to add a little of what you were saying about the services, I recall in my doctor's office, they have a chart there of a number of languages, and if anybody needs any kind of interpretation, that's offered at my doctor's office. But I think, like I said, requirement is a strong word, but I believe that when anybody comes to the United States, it's kind of foreseen that you're gonna need to know English, and if it just depends on what your intent is here and how far you want to go and all that. It just, what is it that what your goal set is, maybe?
Sure. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, you bring up a very good point that if you don't offer services in other languages, that certainly is a way to exclude people and to maintain the power structure. So if you look at that example of the doctor's office, where if people don't have access to information that they can understand. It could be life-threatening. It could seriously impact their health. So it would be quite a exclusion to not offer services in another language. So there's serious consequences for not doing so. I think that's a good point. Well, that's the end of the PowerPoint. So we'll end here. And as I said earlier, I'll post the students' multimedia presentations for the other two chapters that we were going to talk about today. But I kind of feel like the book kind of circles and reiterates a lot of these issues of power and access and standards in terms of language. So I feel like it's getting clearer as we go through it. But I think the more times you touch upon it, the clearer it becomes. So did you have any other questions for me before we end?
Dr. Julie?
I don't. Thank you very much, Dr. Julie.
Thank you.
I am okay, Dr. Julie. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you for showing up, ladies. I really appreciate it. And I'll post this video in Blackboard so that if you want to rewatch it, or you can, and I'll post the PowerPoint so you can have access to that too. And just let me know if you have any other questions as the week goes by. So thank you. Take care.
Sounds good. You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.